not regarded as a factory town, such as the ones dominated by the dark satanic mills of English literature. But parts of the town and its inhabitants were factory dominated. It's only when we look back without the rose-tinted spectacles that we remember the reality of how the factory overshadowed portions of Wexford. In general, Pearses did not monopolise, but did dominate people and areas of the town. As a major employer, this was inevitable. The lockout of 1911 is well documented and shows the effect of the foundries on Wexford life in all its aspects, from work to religion to social interaction. But it was not in disputes that the dominance, predominantly benign, was evident. Even as it peaked and began to dwindle, Pearses was a major force in very many lives. In the 1950s, our lives were, if not ruled, then at least very much influenced by the powerful siren which marked the start and end of the working day. For those who never experienced it, the sound was like an air raid warning siren of the movies, and it was activated at least in the 1950s at 8 a.m, 12:30, 1:30 and around 5:30 p.m. As anyone passing the factory at 12:30 or 5:30, it was like witnessing a Grand Prix start, as pedestrians and cyclists poured out the gates before the siren echo had died. Not that the working day was strictly within those hours. Night work and overtime were very common in that decade. It was not unusual for children returning from school to meet their father or the da for tea, and before they started their homework to say slán leat as he left for the night shift. Working overtime often led to an adventure for the children. Canteens and even thermos flasks were not as common in those days, so the billy can and sandwiches were sent down by the ma at about 5:30. The child's first port of call was to the office, where the late Johnny Byrne was often on duty, to grant permission to enter. Johnny was a sort of security man before the days of uniforms and walkie-talkies. If the child was new to the factory, Johnny would accompany them to their da to take the grub up for them. The older hands were permitted to enter the foundry themselves if they were sure where they were going. In Pearses, you needed to know where you were going and to be very careful. This was a huge factory covering acres and with very many potentially dangerous operations in progress. My dad worked as a welder. His place of work could be reached via the yard or up through the forge. I usually preferred the forge route, especially when my grandfather was working there as foreman. He was Nicky as well, and always called Deda to distinguish him from my dad, who was called Nicky. I was called Nicholas. Our family didn't believe in abbreviations. The forge was a place that I can still recall from the sounds and the smells. It was a huge shed with a number of fires. The predominant sound was the clanging of steel, and the smells were coke and heat. The da as foreman was always dressed in a brown shop coat, a felt hat with a pen protruding from his top pocket. The welding shop, as it was called, was cordoned off as an area at the top of the forge. Here the smell was a sort of ozone scorched air. Me da, and that's what we always called him, was a figure in dungarees with a welding mask and a welding rod which looked like a sparkler fizzing in his hand. His co-workers at the time were Paddy Curran and Hopper McGrath, who was a popular hurler on the county team of the time. Pearses was very much a factory where families worked. I had an uncle who was a foreman in the paint shop and another who worked in either the moulding or the edge tool. The moulding shop was where moulds were made of a sort of sandstone into which metal was poured. The edge tool shop was where tools like spades, sprongs, scythes with sharp edges were manufactured, as the name suggests. In the past, Pearses had been involved in agricultural machinery, but also they made beds, bikes, and even munitions during the 1914-18 war. The tea delivery run that I was on was a special time for youngsters. It brought us into the world of work, the magic of the factory, and meeting the men. It was magic and probably encouraged many to go into that line of employment. Pearses had a social aspect as well. Over the years, before my time that was, they had a social club on Paul Quay and introduced the Tontine Society movement to the town. We covered that institution earlier in the series. There were various social clubs and sports groups within the factory, organised by the men themselves, from horseshoe tossing to much later golf touring or golfing groups. Unusually for Wexford, Pearses also entered the housing provision. Alvina Brook, Caserio and Avenue de Flanders were groups of houses built by Pearses for senior and junior staff members, and they were rented to the staff. Caserio was a very unusual row of terraced houses. 4 of them are accessed via short bridges from the road to the front door over the Horse River, which flows about 12 feet below. The other houses are even more interesting. In these, the front hallway is the bridge over the river. In the rear of these houses, there's a service road which enters at a point near the old distillery and runs behind the houses, dividing the gardens from the backyards. Being built over the river, they've often suffered flooding when the river rose to window level. Caserio, which, by the way, we're really big into language in that part of town, is Latin for house on the river. The houses were occupied mainly by middle management. The foremen more often rented Alvina Brook houses. These were similar to Caserio, but were smaller and single-storey. A distinctive feature was the arched porch and red brick surrounds. The porches of Alvina Brook were echoed by a covered spring or spout near Caserio. This facility had the legend Aqua Pura inscribed above it, and it was a source of water during summer months when the municipal supply was either tainted or depleted. There was a steady stream of bucket carrying, often